April 2026. The world watches with bated breath as a fragile two-week ceasefire holds the Middle East by a literal thread. In Washington, diplomats speak of a grand bargain, a peace treaty that could finally end the decades-long Cold War between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran. But as the ink dries on the proposal in the Oval Office, the reaction from Jerusalem is not one of relief. It is one of alarm. To the casual observer, peace is the ultimate goal. But in the high-stakes game of Levantine geopolitics, Israel views a U.S.-Iran peace treaty not as a solution, but as a death warrant. The cornerstone of any U.S.-Iran deal is, and always has been, the nuclear program. For the United States, a treaty is a way to box in Iran's ambitions. If Iran agrees to stop enriching uranium to weapons-grade levels, the U.S. agrees to lift the crushing economic sanctions that have stifled the Iranian economy. But Israel sees a fundamental flaw in this logic: the sunset clauses. In previous iterations of the nuclear deal, restrictions on Iran's nuclear activity were not permanent. They were temporary, lasting 10 to 15 years. Israel's intelligence community argues that this doesn't stop a nuclear Iran, it merely schedules it. From the Israeli perspective, a treaty is a waiting room. It allows Iran to stabilize its economy, modernize its infrastructure, and wait for the clock to run out. Once the treaty expires, Iran emerges as a legalized nuclear power. For a country the size of New Jersey, which could be devastated by a single nuclear strike, Israel views temporary peace as an unacceptable gamble. Furthermore, Israel points to the nuclear archive stolen from Tehran in 2018 as proof that Iran never intended to stop its weapons research. They believe that as long as the regime exists, the intent remains. Therefore, any treaty is built on a foundation of sand. If the nuclear issue is the long-term threat, the short-term threat is what Israel calls the ring of fire. One of the biggest reasons Israel opposes a U.S.-Iran peace treaty is the issue of sanctions relief. When the U.S. signs a treaty, it unfreezes tens of billions of dollars in Iranian assets held in foreign banks. The U.S. hopes this money will go toward hospitals, schools, and the Iranian middle class. Israel knows better. History shows that a significant portion of that capital is diverted to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This money fuels Hezbollah in Lebanon, which currently sits on an arsenal of over 150,000 precision-guided missiles pointed at Tel Aviv. It fuels the Houthis in Yemen, who disrupt the very shipping lanes that keep the global economy afloat. During the April 2026 ceasefire negotiations, a critical Lebanon loophole emerged. The U.S.-Iran deal focused on Iranian soil, but it said nothing about Hezbollah's activity in the north of Israel. For Israel, a treaty that gives Iran money while its proxies continue to fire rockets is not a peace treaty, it's a subsidized war. Israel's doctrine is simple: you cannot separate the puppeteer from the puppets. If the U.S. funds the puppeteer through trade and lifted sanctions, they are indirectly funding the rockets falling on Israeli homes. To understand the tension today, we have to look back at the events of February 2026. Following a series of drone strikes on Israeli infrastructure, Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a massive, direct kinetic strike against Iranian military facilities. It was the first time the shadow war came fully into the light. The strikes were devastating. They crippled Iran's drone production and damaged several key enrichment facilities. In the aftermath, the Iranian regime found itself at its weakest point in decades. Internal protests were surging, and the military was reeling. This is where the divide between the U.S. and Israel becomes a chasm. The U.S. sees this weakness as the perfect time to force Iran to the table. They want to use the leverage of the strikes to sign a stability agreement to prevent a total regional meltdown. Israel, however, sees this as the time to finish the job. They believe that signing a treaty now would act as a life jacket for a drowning regime. By providing economic relief through a treaty, the U.S. would effectively be saving the very government that Israel is trying to weaken. In Jerusalem's eyes, the only way to ensure long-term peace is the total collapse of the IRGC's power, not a piece of paper that keeps them in power. Beyond the missiles and the centrifuges lies a more human element: a deep-seated trust deficit. For the United States, diplomacy is a tool of management. The U.S. is a global superpower with interests in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and domestic elections. For Washington, a treaty with Iran clears the board, allowing them to focus on other threats like China. For Israel, Iran is not a management issue. It is an existential one. Israeli leaders often feel that the U.S. is too willing to accept Iranian strategic dissimulation to achieve a short-term political win. They remember the 2015 deal, which they believe failed to stop Iranian expansion. There is also the fear of the American pivot. As the U.S. looks to reduce its footprint in the Middle East, Israel fears that a peace treaty is just a way for the U.S. to walk away and leave Israel to deal with a rearmed Iran alone. If the U.S. is no longer the policeman of the region, Israel feels it must remain the soldier who never sleeps. As we stand here in April 2026, the 2-week ceasefire is ending. The U.S. envoys are pleading for a signature. The Iranian leadership is weighing its survival. And Israel is preparing its jets. Why doesn't Israel want this peace treaty? Because they don't believe it is peace. To Israel, it is a pause. A pause that allows their enemy to breathe, to bankroll its proxies, and to eventually build a weapon that cannot be countered. The tragedy of the Middle East is that one man's diplomatic breakthrough is another man's existential threat. Until the underlying reality of the Iranian regime changes, or until Israel feels its security can be guaranteed by more than just a signature, the cycle of shadow wars and epic furies is likely to continue.